Good to be together today on this first Sunday in October. A number of years ago, when Calvin Coolidge was president, he's one who grew up in the Green Mountains of Vermont, and his faith was shaped in the Congregational church tradition. And when he and Grace moved to Washington, they attended the Congregational church regularly. On one Sunday, the president went by himself, and when he came home, Grace asked him, said, what did the minister preach about today? What did the minister preach about today? And he said, sin. And she said, what did he say about it? He was against it. Calvin Coolidge was a very plain-spoken man. We are talking about sin today as we move into the second segment of our quarterly study. The overall theme is simply God for this quarter, and we focused on the attributes of God in the lessons in September. And today we begin a series on the qualities or attributes of human beings that God has created. We know that humans were created in the image of God. Every human being is created in the image of God. But we also knew that man fell. Adam and Eve succumbed to temptation in the Garden of Eden. And the fall has had an effect on the image of God, but the image is still there. The gracious thing about God is that He is not leaving us in that condition. God is at work. He has been at work in redeeming what was lost in the fall. At some point in history, about 2,000 years before Christ, God spoke to a man named Abraham, and He promised him that He would make of his family and the nation that sprung from his family a great nation. He would bless this nation, and through this nation, through the family of Abraham, He would bless all nations of the earth. This is a tremendous promise, and it's one that we see taking place and being fulfilled throughout Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. When the children of Israel, Abraham's offspring, were in Egypt as slaves, you recall that God called Moses to deliver them, and through God's power, they were delivered through the Red Sea. And as they came to Sinai, which was about a 3-day journey from Egypt, the Lord reminded them that they are a treasured possession out of all peoples. Very high expectations of these people that He had chosen, and that they were to be a priestly kingdom to the other nations. So they had an assignment. They were being blessed, but they were to be blessings. And the central character that we study today is the one who succeeded Moses. You recall that Moses led the children of Israel for a period of 40 years through the wilderness between Sinai and the Promised Land. And early in the time in the desert, in the wilderness, the Israelites were attacked by the Amalekites, and Moses designated a young man named Joshua to put together a number of men to repel the Amalekites' attack. And so that's the first that we learn of Joshua as a very young man. Second thing that we know about him in his early days is that when Moses ascended Sinai, he took Joshua with him. So there was a very close relationship between Joshua and Moses. And finally, Joshua was one of 12 spies that Moses sent on a reconnaissance mission up into what would become the Promised Land to scout it out. And it was only Joshua and Caleb who came back with a positive report saying that we can do this with God's help. We can take this land that he's giving us. The other 10 were negative in their response. They said, we can never do this. The people there are too big, they're too strong for us. And so they indicated that they would not be a part of that. And it was for that reason that for the next 38 years, the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. When those 38 years had elapsed, the children of Israel had moved in a northerly direction on the east side of the Jordan River, and it was at flood stage. Moses had already died, and he had placed his mantle on this young man, or middle-aged man by this time, Joshua. As God opened the Red Sea, so he opened the Jordan River at flood stage and created a dry path for the children of Israel to cross. The first city that they looked at and knew that would be their first city to take was Jericho. Jericho is one of the oldest cities on earth. It is a city that is 750 feet below sea level. How many of you know how low New Orleans is?
Sea level.
Sea level, yeah. They're below 8 feet below sea level, and we think of New Orleans as being below sea level because of their burial practices. But compare that to the 750 feet below sea level of Jericho. That was an oasis, and no wonder that it was one of the first cities on earth. The abundant supply of water. Even to this day, 1,000 gallons come out of that spring every minute. 1,000 gallons a minute at that oasis. And so no wonder civilization flourished around there. A recent theory of where the Old Testament Jericho comes from a man named Richard Hess, who knows his archaeological literature very well. He's also a careful student of the Bible. And it's Richard Hess's opinion that this Jericho that Joshua and the children of Israel are going to be dealing with is primarily a military fortress. It had other people in it. You had Rahab, the prostitute, and probably had a business of prostitution. But primarily, these were combatants, Richard Hess believes, in Jericho at that time. You recall the way Jericho was taken. It was a most unusual battle strategy. The people of Israel were to walk around the city one time a day, and for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, they were to walk around 7 times. And at the end of the 7th round, the priest blew the trumpet, and the people shouted. And as you know, what happened? The walls came tumbling down. And so Jericho was taken. It was the first city in the Promised Land to be taken by the people of Israel. Some very careful instructions were given to the Israelites as the walls came down in Jericho. They were to protect the prostitute Rahab. Rahab had worked with spies from the Israeli community in preparing them to take Jericho. And because she had faith in the God of Israel, she was to be saved. She and her family were to be saved. Everything else was to be destroyed there. I read the text from Joshua 6. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet and take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel an object for destruction, bringing trouble upon it. But all silver and gold, the vessels of bronze and iron, are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So there was going to be no personal profiting from the taking of Jericho. It was a very clear directive from the Lord through Joshua to the people. And so when Jericho was taken, the fame of Joshua became very great. And that's the way chapter 6 ends, and the transition from chapter 6 to chapter 7 is jarring. Let me read the last verse and then transition into the first verse of chapter 7. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. But the Israelites broke faith in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, son of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the Israelites. This point of view expressed in the first verse is from the omniscient point of view of the narrator. Joshua doesn't yet know that the band booty has been taken. The Israelites have broken faith. Achan, an Israelite of noble heritage, has taken some of the devoted things. But the text says here that the anger of the Lord was burning hot against Israel, not just Achan. Since Joshua didn't know that this had happened, he sent his people, he sent a small number of his people to a city about 10 miles west of Jericho. It's a city called Ai. The ascent of these people that he sent originally is 3,400 feet, so it's quite a climb. And Joshua's spies, his contingent of spies that he sent, brought back a very optimistic report saying that we can take Ai. Well, the result was that when Israel attempted to take Ai with just about 3 squads of men, they failed. 36 Israelites were killed in that engagement. And so Joshua, who had been very optimistic, that was part of his nature, to be optimistic. You can see that in his history, that he was an optimistic man. He tended to believe the best. But he was so discouraged after the defeat at Ai that he fell on his face before God for almost a day. And he complained to God, why have you allowed this defeat? Why have you brought us on the west side of the Jordan River? Why didn't you just leave us over there? And that's reminiscent of some of the complaining of the children of Israel in the early days when they came out of Egypt. He said, why did you bring us out of Egypt, out of slavery? We would rather be there than in this desert. So as Joshua prays, the Lord speaks to him and gives him the reason why the battle failed. The Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I imposed on them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have acted deceitfully, and they have put them among their own belongings. Therefore the Israelites are now unable to stand before their enemies. They turn their back to their enemies because they have become a thing for destruction themselves. I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you." And so Joshua had the task of doing some research and ferreting out who the guilty party or parties were in taking the items that were banned. Continuing in chapter 7, Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel near tribe by tribe, and the tribe of Judah was taken. So they used lots among all the tribes of Israel, and the lot fell on the tribe of Judah. Then he continued that process. He brought near the clans of Judah, and the clan of the Zerahites was taken. So the lot fell on them. It's narrowing down here. And he brought the clan of the Zerahites, family by family, and Zabdi was taken. And he brought his household one by one, and Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, was taken. So he narrows it down to the person who is guilty of taking that which was prohibited. It's reminiscent of Jonah, isn't it? You recall Jonah the prophet was commissioned to go to Nineveh, and he went just the opposite direction. He went out, took a ship west in the Mediterranean, and he hid down in the lowest part of the ship, in the hold, and a tremendous storm came up, and the ship was about to sink. The captain woke Jonah up and said, "Aren't you need to be aware of what's going on." And so they went through this process that similar to what Joshua did in ferreting out the person who had done wrong. And of course, the lot fell with Jonah. And you know how that story went. Continuing in chapter 7, Joshua speaks to Achan, on whom the lot has fallen, and says, "My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel, and make confession to him. Tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me." And Achan answered Joshua, "It is true. I am the one who sinned against the Lord God of Israel. This is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, then I coveted them and took them. They now lie hidden in the ground inside my tent, with the silver underneath." So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and there it was, hidden in his tent, the silver underneath. They took them out of the tent and brought them to Joshua and all the Israelites, and they spread them out before the Lord. The result of this is that this family, Achan and his family, were commanded to be stoned to death. They were burned, and there was a heap of rocks placed on the place where they died. If we fast forward or move forward, say 1,500 years to the early parts of AD 30, Let's imagine ourselves in the city of Jerusalem. Jesus is there. He's just come down to the city from the Mount of Olives. And the sin detectives in Jerusalem have brought to him a woman who was taken in the very act of adultery. And so they, believing that this man is soft on sin, ask him, remind him that the law of Moses commands that this woman be stoned. What are you going to do about it, Jesus? And so you recall that Jesus kneels down on the ground and he writes in the dust. Then he gets up and he says, now you who are without sin, cast the first stone on this woman who has sinned. He got down on the ground again, and as he got up the second time, he noticed that one by one, all of the accusers were gone. Jesus looked at the woman, and he said, ask her, where are your accusers? And she said, Lord, there are none. He said, go your way and do not sin anymore. I bring these two together to show we have a stoning 1,500 years before. We have an almost incidence of stoning. What is the difference? What has made the difference here? Jesus is there. And it's not that Jesus is soft on sin. Jesus is not soft on sin because not many days hence he will bear this woman's sin as he gives his life on the cross. I would even say that Jesus there gave his life for this man Achan. I would say that the Apostle John says he died for the sins of the whole world. And so Jesus has the right and the authority to do what he did. We are grateful that he upholds justice, but at the same time he goes far beyond justice and offers mercy. Now, in the Wesleyan tradition, the matter of receiving forgiveness is very important. It's very important as a first step, but it's only a first step. John Wesley realized that the Christian life is much more complicated than simply receiving forgiveness. It's a journey. It's an arduous journey. And he saw that it's very important, what was articulated in Davis's sermon today, that those on this path be together, that they walk together, and that they hold each other accountable. One of John Wesley's great innovations was the group, or the band as they call it, where 5 or 6 people would come together and they would be very honest with each other. In Wesley's group, these are 5 questions that would be asked. What known sins have you committed since our last meeting? What temptations have you met with? How were you delivered? What have you thought, said, or done which you doubt whether it be sin or not? Have you nothing that you desire to keep secret? And so in these intimate groups of followers of Jesus, there was a trust built, and there was a safe place for people to reveal those things that are hidden, that give us problems and cause us to be tempted and even to sin, having been tempted. When we think about the case of Achan again, he probably didn't have anyone to talk to. He saw this valuable material, the gold, the silver, the precious garment from Shinar. And on the one hand, he saw that, but on the other, he had God's command. When you put those side by side, God's command seems fairly remote. But these goods of gold and silver and the precious garment are so close, they are so close at hand and to one's senses that they're powerful in tempting one. The people who comment on the value of the gold and silver say that this was probably wealth for a lifetime. Achan would have been financially, economically secure by having that. But it was just too powerful. And so he yielded to it and took it. I wonder if you have questions or observations about the Achan account or the way we've tied it to the woman that Jesus forgave. Yes, Chip?
Guess who's back? Oh, by the way, you know, when Joshua goes into Canaan and he asks God, oh, Lord, I have to do this, and God tells him 3 times, be strong and courageous. Well, I was in Las Vegas this weekend. I was strong and courageous 3 times, but the slot machine still won. But here's my question. Did God soften his heart when Jesus made his statement to the lady? Did God change, or was God the same? Or was it the interpretation of God's command? Does that make any sense?
Yes, that's an excellent question, Chip. That is an excellent question. Has God changed? Would anyone like to respond to that before I talk?
Steve, if you can't do it, none of us can.
Well, one approach is to say that the command was misunderstood in the Old Testament. I'm inclined not to say that because I believe that God is just, and I think that as Eddie has reminded me as late as this morning, the crime or the punishment must fit the crime. And so what Achan did here was a terrible thing, not just for him and his family, but he undermined God's mission. He undermined the whole nation in what he did. And I'm inclined to think that Joshua heard God correctly. Now, I think that from before God created the world, he was compassionate love. He has always been compassionate love, but he is just as well. And I see the reconciliation of his justice and love in the death of Jesus. I don't see Jesus as a victim in this case. I see Jesus, the Son of God, as being one with his Father in coming into the world and in going to the cross. And in going to the cross, he bore the consequences of Achan's sin. He bore his sin. He bore the prostitute's sin. And he bears my sin and your sin. That's simply how I see it. Yes, Patsy.
I can understand why Achan was stoned. I don't understand when his family, his goats, his cattle, everything he owned, they didn't have anything to do with that.
Right. Now, his family, we don't know about his family. Tent was very small. To hide those goods under the earth in a tent, someone knew what was going on.
The cattle?
Well, I don't know. No, not the cow. Not the cow.
That's a lot.
I think that Jesus brought the repentance, and he said to the woman that she had to repent. That was not explained. They didn't use that approach of repentance at the time of Achan.
Well, in a sense, they did with the sacrifices. When a person sinned, there were numerous sacrificial approaches, and of course, the Day of Atonement was initiated before this event. So people were aware of sin, forgiveness of sin, being freed from the penalty of sin. But in this case, as much as Achan knew, what was presently tempting him was far stronger than his sense of what God wanted from him.
Steve,
Yes.
how does that tie in today with communion? We're forgiven for sin there.
Yes. Well, we are, what Christ did for us on the cross is once for all, and we receive that forgiveness initially, but then we receive it as we sin. I sin almost every day, probably every day. And at the end of the day, as I take account of things, I seek to be transparent to God about those attitudes, those words that I've said, those behaviors that fall outside of what is really loving. Augustine said this, he said, love God and do whatever you wish. When you love God, you're going to be okay. You're not going to sin like I do.
He says, go and sin no more.
Right. And I think the thing of the Wesley Band is a wonderful innovation on the part of John Wesley to help people in sinning no more. When we are transparent with each other about what's going on within, it takes the power from those temptations that we have. I've had two instances in my life where I was severely tempted to do things that would have a great impact far beyond me. And in both cases, it was so strong that I went to someone and I laid it out before them. And when I did that, it took the power away from those temptations. Now, I'm tempted every day. I'm still tempted every day, not with the same kind of things that I dealt with that I just told you about, but being honest with others, looking at these things in the company of people who love you as a way of taking the power out of these temptations. Anyone else? Chip?
No, I got one more, maybe. What's interesting to me is Jesus gave the option of sin no more. Joshua and the law of Moses didn't give you that option.
Right.
They gave you the option of doing it or not doing it, but there wasn't given us time to redeem ourselves from our sin.
Well, I think Achan is an unusual case. I think because of the transition nature of Israel at that time, those of you who have served in the military know that things that can be passed over in civilian society, there are some things that simply cannot be passed over in a military operation, and military justice is much more demanding than civilian justice. Doris?
I was just gonna say, in response to Patsy, I think the message about the goats and the cows is that no one will benefit from this sin.
Right.
Because whoever got the goats or cows would have in fact been enriched. And so the message is no one's gonna benefit from this.
Right. That's a good point. Good point. Very good point.
Thank you.
Yes. Todd?
Maybe.
In that same vein, one other point made is that Achan had lost his way. And I think you made the comment that he had no one to talk to.
Yeah.
But he did have somebody to talk to. I think you're incorrect. He had God to talk to.
Yes.
And he didn't.
Yes.
And, you know, he had totally lost his way. And I think that is one way to reconcile the severity of the punishment.
Yes, I agree. He certainly did have God to talk to, but I think the physical presence of these things were so much more powerful to him at that time than God was. Yes. Thank you for that point, John. Anything else? Yes, Judy?
I've been told in several Bible studies that when we sin, where God forgives us, and we ask for forgiveness, but we also have to do something else. We have to repent our sin and not repeat it.
That's what Jesus was, exactly what Jesus was saying. Don't do this again.
Yes.
Go and sin no more. And that's why we need a company of people
Right.
around us to help us walk Christ's path. Anything else? Yeah, Bill?
I think you could look at the magnitude of the punishment as being an example for all of Israel. And I always have doubts about this business of drawing straws, how accurate it can be. So this Achan was from the tribe of Judah, the largest tribe, and he was paying the dues by example for the sins of Israel, not just himself and his
Yes.
family.
And you're pointing out his lineage is relevant here. Judah is the tribe from whom David would come and from whom the Messiah would come. So he was blessed from his family heritage. He should have known better. He knew more than many Israelites, and again, that figures into this. Anything else?
And one other,
Yes.
the study book uses Rahab as an example.
Yes.
The fact that even though she was a prostitute, she was a spy for Israel
Yes.
in the situation regarding Jericho.
Yes.
And as such, after Jericho fell, she was taken into the tribe or into the group of Israelites.
She was protected. She
And
was
protected.
part of the command to protect this woman who, you talk about baggage.
Yes.
She had baggage, but here's the thing, grace overcomes baggage. Grace overcomes baggage. And you compare her with this man who should have known better, and it's a very striking contrast. One of the things that, as I studied this lesson, and I struggled with this, and I asked for some prayer from a couple of men, and this is a hard lesson. But one of the things that came through to me is the widespread consequences of who we are and what we do, ripple effects out there. And in closing, I'd like to tell you about one situation where a man in Russia did something very good that made a difference in each life in here. You may never have heard of him. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. You remember where you were on the 26th of September, 1983? On that day, Colonel Petrov was at a station near Moscow, and his job in the air defense system in Russia was to monitor what was going on with other nations. And an alarm went off in his group indicating that 5 Minuteman ICBM missiles were on the way from the United States to Russia. You talk about a decision that had to be made. Colonel Petrov thought through things. He thought through, and this was in just a few days after Russia had shot down that Korean passenger plane. You recall that from 1983. And that factored into his mind. He said, you know, the U.S. is retaliating now. But Colonel Petrov maintained his focus, and he decided not to retaliate against the U.S. because there was really nothing coming from the U.S. It was a false thing. But if he had responded with missiles, then we would have responded with missiles. And think how many millions of people would have died that day if he had not been as wise and judicious as he was. And so from wise decisions, from careful decisions, flow many good things that we may never be aware of. Thanks be to God.
Amen.